being advised to remember how deeply untrustworthy President Putin is, and also be reminded of how the Russians tend to negotiate. They always put in totally unreasonable demands. That's that kind of given tactic. And they will then give nothing in return.
Joe Biden's comments there about being prepared in theory to speak to Vladimir Putin, coupled with the German Chancellor urging Putin to find a diplomatic solution. Is there a bit of a shift in rhetoric here from the US and the EU?
I'm not sure it's a shift in rhetoric. I think it's to be applauded that the United States president would wish to speak to President Putin in the right circumstances. I mean, we're all very lucky to benefit from the United States leadership. And President Biden recently spoke to President Xi in China, clearly very, very different circumstances. But talking is always a good thing. But a conversation between President Biden and President Putin is a very different thing from a timetable, a path into peace negotiations. And I have no doubt that President Biden, if he went into a conversation with President Putin, would have in the back of his mind, and he'd be being advised to remember how deeply untrustworthy President Putin is, and also be reminded of how the Russians tend to negotiate. They always put in totally unreasonable demands. That's that kind of given tactic. And they will then give nothing in return. It's a very unusual form of negotiating. Right. So any conversation by President Biden, I think it's always good to talk, but that's a different thing to peace negotiations.
Well, so how remote, in your view, then, are peace negotiations, some kind of successful treaty in the long term?
Well, I mean, war typically ends in talking. A war like this will almost certainly end in talking, but it can only come when all sides are ready for it. And our Ukrainian friends wouldn't quite rightly wish to see the war end at the moment. They need to regain their territory, and any negotiations must come with the full backing of President Zelensky. It's also worth remembering that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian military have the initiative. They have the advantage. It would be very careless to give that up at the moment.
So that's interesting that you mentioned President Zelensky there, because obviously both sides have set conditions for peace talks. And it seems to be very little common ground at the moment. But some Ukrainians are wary and rightly and understandably sensitive to any kind of weakening of resolve in the US and the EU. Do you think resolve is weakening and that this rhetoric is in some way pointing to that?
My sense is that no, resolve isn't weakening. I think NATO, as the military alliance, has remained strong throughout. Of course, publics across Europe look at their own pockets and their own living conditions first. But all I would say is in worrying about our own domestic circumstances, we should remain very alive to what our friends in Ukraine are going through. And I don't think this does point to a weakening. I think it just points to President Macron, of course, has been talking to President Putin intermittently throughout the war. And it's no surprise he's just been in Washington, and President Biden, forgive me, is now talking about a conversation. A conversation is a good thing. A dialogue is a good thing. Adversaries tend to talk during conflict, because ultimately that will be the route to peace. But in no way should that be conflated with conceding Ukraine's initiative and President Zelensky's aims.
So you talked about the losses that are being sustained by the Ukrainians, both in military terms, obviously, in terms of the number of troops. We had an estimate that's likely to be conservative of 13,000 Ukrainian soldiers to have lost their lives. Obviously, the Ukrainian people, too, living in terrible conditions in many parts of the country. Will the number of troops being lost and the amount of weaponry being lost, will that, in the end, push Ukraine and Russia? I mean, how much longer can they sustain this rate of loss?
Well, I mean, it's for our Ukrainian friend on the call to really comment on that. But as a military person and observing the Ukrainians, they have demonstrated, and they continue to demonstrate, incredible tenacity, incredible courage and fighting spirit. and desired to defend their homeland. And all the evidence points to the resilience of the Ukrainian people. Yes, they're going through the most diabolical conditions, not least since President Putin has been attacking their critical infrastructure. But historically, making people cold, killing people in their homes, does not bring proud nations to their knees.
Right.
And I see no evidence that it's going to bring the Ukrainian people to their knees.
Just final question. There has been some suggestion that Western countries are running short of weaponry to send. They're struggling to replenish their stockpiles. Is that an issue here?
Well, it's no secret that NATO nations have not had enough stockpiles of ammunition for a very long time. So all sorts of reasons for that are the kind of calculations that they're based on, the amount of money that these munitions cost, mean that the stockpiles are not great enough. And all nations will be trying to regulate what they provide to the Ukrainians while keeping half an eye on their own stocks and also trying to re-energize the industrial base. But of course, these are advanced munitions and they are not quick to produce.
Major General Rupert Jones, thank you very much for joining us. Let's turn now then to Lesia Vasilenko, who's a Ukrainian MP. Lesia, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon.
I just want to put some of a flavour of what we were talking about just then, specifically Joe Biden's comments that he's prepared to speak to Vladimir Putin in theory. How do you respond to that?
In theory, anything is possible. In theory, it's even possible that Russia stops its aggression out of its own free will and pays out all the reparations to Ukraine. But in practice and in reality, we all understand that we are facing something entirely different. Russia will only stop when it is made to stop. And I think the best treatment that Russia can get from the West and should be getting from the West is the kind of treatment that Russia is showing to the rest of the world.
Do you worry then that resolve in parts of the EU, maybe Germany perhaps, and possibly the US too, do you think resolve is weakening there?
Resolve cannot be weakening. We see it by the amount of weapons that Ukraine is getting, also the amounts of ammunition and how fast they are being delivered to Ukraine. So that is on the rise. And I very much hope that this will be the system for the next, I don't know how many months that are needed for Ukraine to call it a confident victory over Russia and over Russian aggression. At the same time, having said that, I realize that the longer this war goes on, the more fatigue will be settling in, and the abnormal is becoming normal, and it's no longer a sensation. There's less talk about it, and hence there's less support. But I also hope that we have all learned our lesson from 2014, 2015, when the same kind of fatigue set in and caused us to do nothing for almost 8 years, and then this nothing exploded into an all-out invasion, the consequences of which we all have to deal with.
You say you don't know, understandably, how many months are ahead in this war, given the appalling conditions for some Ukrainian people and also the incredible loss of life amongst your military. What are your fears for the winter and the war ahead?
Right, the winter is definitely going to be cold and dark for most Ukrainian cities. Russia is hitting energy infrastructure. The direct missile hits and the drones are focused on hitting as many power stations, power lines as possible, and basically anything that keeps the cities going. We knew that this would be happening since August. We tried to prepare as best as we could, was calling for more air defense systems to be delivered to Ukraine. Still around 30% of the territory of Ukraine remains uncovered support by air defense. This is why there's appeals from politicians like myself, from our president, for more air defense capacities to be delivered to Ukraine. And also in winter, we have to understand that the Ukrainians are not interested in stopping the fighting and the counteroffensive. We will keep going as much as the weather conditions will permit our armies to advance. Also bearing in mind that human lives do matter to Ukrainians and to Ukraine's military command, so also trying to save the livelihood of our military units. But at the same time, having said that, we understand that come spring, it will really be there will be a really need for reaccumulation of resources and mobilization of all the military potential inside Ukraine and beyond to really push the Russian military out. And this is in all of our interests in Ukraine and beyond to end this war at the latest summer.